Section 31 of T. de Witt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. T. de Witt Talmage as I Knew Him by Eleanor McCutcheon Collier Talmage. Milestone 3, Part 1. The third milestone, 1900 to 1901. So much has been written about Dr. Talmage the world over that I am tempted to tell those things about him that have not been written, but it is difficult to do. He stood always before the people, a sort of radiant mystery to them. He was never really understood by those whom he most influenced. A writer in an English newspaper has given the best description of his appearance in 1900 I ever saw. It is so much better than any I could make that I quote it, regretting that I do not know the author's name. A big man, erect and masterful in spite of advancing years, with an expressive and mobile mouth that seems ever smiling, and with great and speaking eyes which proclaim the fervent soul beneath. This portrait is very true, with a suggestion of his nature that makes it a faithful transcript of his presence. It is a picture of him at 66 years of age. His strength overwhelmed people, and yet he was very simple, easily affected by the misfortunes of others, direct in all his impressions, but no one could take him by surprise, because his faith in the eternal redemption of all trials was beyond the ways of the world. His optimism was simple Christianity. He always said he believed there was as great a number out of the church as there was in it that followed the teaching of Christianity. He was among the believers, with his utmost energy alert to save and comfort the unbelievers. He believed in everything and every one. The ingenuousness of his nature was childlike in its unchallenged faith and its tender instincts. His unworldliness was almost legendary in its belief of human nature. I remember he was asked once whether he believed in Santa Claus, and in his own beautiful imagery he said, "I believe in Santa Claus. Haven't I listened when I was a boy and almost heard those bells on the reindeer? Haven't I seen the marks in the snow where the sleigh stopped at the door and old Santa jumped out? I believed in him then, and I believe in him now. Believe that children should be allowed to believe in the beautiful mythical tale. It never hurt anyone, and I think one of the saddest memories of my childhood is of a day when an older brother told me there was no Santa Claus. I didn't believe him at first, and afterwards when I saw those delightful mysterious bundles being sneaked into the house, way down deep in my heart I believed that Santa Claus as well as my father and mother had something to do with it." In the last years of his life music became the greatest pleasure to Dr. Talmage. An accumulation of work made it necessary for me to engage a secretary. We were fortunate in securing a young lady who was an exquisite pianist. In the evening she would play Liszt's Rhapsodies for the doctor, who enjoyed the Hungarian composer most of all. He said to me once that he felt as if music in his study, when he was at work, would be a great inspiration. So my Christmas present to him that year was a musical box, which he kept in his study. The 3 months preceding our trip to Europe were spent in the usual busy turmoil of social and public life. In truth, we were very full of our plans for the European tour, which was to be devoted to preaching by Dr. Talmage and to show me the places he had seen and people he had met on previous visits. There was something significant in the welcome and the ovations which my husband received over there. Neither the doctor nor myself ever dreamed that it would be his farewell visit. And yet it seems to me now that he was received everywhere in Europe as if they expected it to be his last. I must confess that we look forward to our jaunt across the water so eagerly that the events of the preceding months did not seem very important. With Dr. Talmage I went on his usual lecture trip west, stopping in Chicago where the doctor preached in his son's church. Everywhere we were invited to be the guests of some prominent resident of the town we were in. It had been so with Dr. Talmage for years. He always refused, however, because he felt that his time was too imperative a taskmaster. For 30 years he had never visited anyone overnight, until he went to my brother's house in Pittsburgh. but we were constantly meeting old friends of his, friends of many years, in every stopping place of our journeys. I remember particularly one of these characteristic meetings which took place in New York, where the doctor had gone to preach one Sunday. We had just entered the Waldorf Hotel, where we were stopping, when a little man stepped up to the doctor and began picking money off his coat. He seemed to find it all over him. Dr. Talmage laughed and introduced me to Marshall P. Wilder. "Dr. Talmage started me in life," said Mr. Wilder, and proceeded to tell me how the doctor had filled him with optimism and success. He was always doing this, gripping young men by the shoulders and shaking them into healthful life, and then men of political or national prominence were always seeking him out to gain a little dynamic energy and balance from the doctor's storehouse of experience and philosophy. He was a giant of helpfulness and inspiration to everyone who came into contact with him. In January we dined with Governor Stone at the Executive Mansion in Harrisburg, where Dr. Talmage went to preach, and on our return from Europe Governor Stone insisted upon giving us a great reception and welcome. Of course, those years were stirring and enjoyable and never to be forgotten. The reflected glory is a personal pleasure after all. In April 1900 we sailed on the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, bound for London. The 2 points of interest the doctor insisted upon making in Europe were the North Cape, to see the midnight sun, and the Passion Play at Ober Ammergau. Hundreds of invitations had been sent to him to preach abroad, many of which he accepted, but he could not be persuaded to lecture. There was never a jollier, more electric companion de voyage than Dr. Talmage during the whole of his trip. He was the life of the party, which included his daughter, Miss Maud Talmage, and my daughter, Miss Rebecca Collier. On a very stormy Sunday, on board ship going over, Dr. Talmage preached, holding on to a pillar in the cabin. There were some who wondered how he escaped the tortures of mal de mer, from which he had always suffered. It was a family secret. Once, when crossing with Mrs. Vanderbilt, she had given Dr. Talmage an opium plaster, which was absolute proof against the disagreeable consequences of ocean travel. With the aid of this plaster the doctor's poise was perfect. Disembarking at Southampton, we did not reach London until 3 a.m., going to the hotel somewhat the worse for wear. Temporarily we stopped at Langham, moving later to the Metropole. Before lunch the same day the doctor drove to Westminster Abbey to see the grave of Gladstone. It was his first thought, his first duty. It had been his custom for many years to visit the graves of his friends whenever he could be near them. It was a characteristic impulse of Dr. Talmage's to follow to the edge of eternity those whom he had known and liked. When he was asked in England what he had come to do there, he said, "I am visiting Europe with the hope of reviving old friendships and stimulating those who have helped me in the old gospel of kindness." His range of vision was always from the gospel point of view, not necessarily denominational. I remember he was asked, while in England, if there was an organization in America akin to the Evangelical Council of Free Churches, and he said, while there was no such body, there was a common platform in the United States upon almost every subject. The principal topic in England then was the Boer War, which aroused so much hostility in our country. The doctor's sympathies were with the Boers, but he tactfully evaded any public expression of them in England. Although he was interviewed widely on the subject, he never believed in rumours that were current, that the United States would interfere in the Transvaal, and prophesied that the American government would not do so, remembering their common origin. "The great need in America," he said, "is of accurate information about the Transvaal affairs. A great many Democratic politicians are trying to make presidential capital out of the Boer disturbances, but it is doubtful how far these politicians will be permitted to dictate the policy of even their own party." I remember the candidature for president of Admiral Dewey was discussed with Dr. Talmage, who had no very empathetic views about the matter, except to declare Admiral Dewey's tremendous popularity and to acknowledge his support by the good Democrats of the country. The doctor was convinced, however, that Mr. McKinley would be the next president at this time. The first service in England which Dr. Talmage conducted was in Cavendish Chapel at Manchester. The next was at Albert Hall in Nottingham, under the auspices of the Y.M.C.A. He was described in the Nottingham newspapers as the most alive man in the United States. A great crowd filled the hall at Nottingham, and as usual he was compelled to hold an open-air meeting afterwards. The first lecture he ever delivered in England was given in this place 21 years before. Nothing interfered with the routine of the doctor's habits of industry during all this European trip. He had taken over with him the proofs of about 20 volumes of his selected sermons for correction, and all his spare moments were spent in perfecting and revising these books for the printer. His sermons were the only monument he wished to leave to posterity. It has caused me the deepest regret that these books have not been perpetuated as he so earnestly wished. In addition to this work he wrote his weekly sermon for the syndicate, employing stenographers whenever he might be in Europe 2 days every week for that purpose. And yet he never lost interest in the opportunities of travel, eagerly planning trips to the old historic places nearby. Near Nottingham is the famous Byron country, which Dr. Talmage had never found time to visit when he was in Europe before. We were told at the hotel in Nottingham that no visitors were allowed inside Newstead Abbey, so that when we ordered a carriage to drive there the hotel people shrugged their shoulders at what they regarded as our American irreverence. The rain was coming down in torrents when we started. The doctor more than ever determined to overthrow British custom in his quiet, positive way. Through slush and mud, under dripping trees, across country landscape veiled in the tender mist of clouds, we finally arrived at the Abbey. The huge outer gates were open, but the driver, with proper British respect for the law, stopped his horses. The doctor leaned his head out of the carriage window and told him to drive into the grounds. Obediently he did so, and at last we reached the great heavy doors of the entrance. Dr. Talmage jumped out and boldly rang the bell. A sentry appeared to inform us that no one was allowed inside the Abbey. "But we have come all the way from America to see this place," the doctor urged. The sentry, with wooden militarism, was adamant. "Is there no one inside in authority?" the doctor finally asked. Then the housekeeper was called. She told us that the Abbey belonged to an army officer and his wife, that his master was away at the war in South Africa, where his wife had gone with him, and that her orders were imperative. "Look here, just let us see the lower floor," said Dr. Talmage. "We have come all the way from New York to see this place." And he slipped 2 sovereigns into her hand. Still she was unmoved. My daughter, who was then about 14, was visibly disappointed. England was to her hallowed ground, and she was keenly anxious to walk in the footsteps of all its romance, which she had eagerly absorbed in history. Turning to the doctor, she said, almost tearfully, "Why, Dr. Talmage, how can they refuse you?" The housekeeper caught the name. "Who did you say this was?" she asked. "Dr. Talmage," said my daughter. "Dr. Talmage, I was just reading the sermon you preached on Sunday in the Nottingham newspaper. I am sure if my mistress were at home she would be glad to receive you. Come in, come in." So we saw Newstead Abbey. The housekeeper insisted that we should stay to tea, and made us enter our names in the visitors' book, and asked the doctor to write his name on a card, saying, "I will send this to my mistress in South Africa." In the effort to remember many of the details of our stay in England and Scotland, I find it necessary to take refuge for information in my daughter's diary. It amused Dr. Talmage very much as he read it page by page. I find this entry made in Manchester, where she was not well enough to attend church. Sunday, a.m. Dr. Talmage preached, and I was disappointed that I could not go. The people went wild about the doctor, and he had to make an address after church out of doors for those who could not get inside. Several policemen stood around the church door to keep away the crowd. I saw the High Sheriff driving home from church. He was inside a coach that looked as though it had been drawn out of a fairy tale. A huge coach painted red and gold, the crowns or something like them at each of the 4 corners. 2 footmen dressed in George III liveries were hanging behind by ribbons, and 2 in the box, all wearing powdered wigs. To be sure, I didn't see much of the sheriff, but then the coach was a real show after all. Many of the details of the side trips which we made through England and Scotland have escaped my memory. In looking over my daughter's diary, I find them amplified in the manner of girlhood, now lightly touched with fancy, now solemn with historical responsibility, now charmed with the glamour of romance. Dr. Talmage thought so well of them that they will serve to show the trial of his footsteps through the gateways of ancestral England. We went to Haddon Hall with Dr. Wrench, physician to the Duke of Devonshire. We drove from Bakewell. In this part of my daughter's diary I read, "It was a most beautiful drive. Derbyshire is called the Switzerland of England. The hills were quite high and beautifully wooded, and our drive lay along the river's edge. A brook we would call it in the States, but it is a river here, and winds in and out and through the fields and around the foot of the highest hill of all, called the Peak of Derbyshire. We passed picturesque little farmhouses, built of square blocks of rough grey stone, covered with ivy. We drove between hawthorn hedges, through beautiful green fields and orchards. From the midst of a little forest of grand old trees we caught sight of the highest tower of the castle. Then we crossed over a little stone bridge and passed through the gates. Another short drive across the meadow, and we stopped at the foot of a little hill, looking up at Haddon Hall. We walked up to the castle and stood before the great iron-studded oak door, which has been there since the days of Queen Elizabeth. It had not been opened for years, but a smaller one had been cut in through which visitors passed. For over 200 years no one had lived in the castle. It was built by the Normans and given by William the Conqueror to one of his Norman barons. Finally, by marriage, it became the property of Sir George Vernon, who had 2 daughters famous for their beauty. Margaret Vernon married a Stanley, and on the night of the wedding Dorothy Vernon eloped with Mr. John Manners. The story is very romantic. The ballroom from which Dorothy stole away while the wedding party was at its height is still just as it was then, excepting for the furniture. From the windows you can see the little stone bridge where Manners waited for her with the horses. Haddon Hall became the property of Dorothy Manners and has remained in the hands of the Rutland family, being now owned by the Duke of Rutland. That is the romance of Haddon Hall, but one could make up 100 to one's self when one walks through the different rooms. What a queer feeling it gives me to go through the old doorways, to stop and look through the queer little windows and on the courtyard, wondering who used long ago to look out of the same windows. I wonder what they saw going on in the courtyard. We climbed to the top of the highest tower. The stairway wound upward, with stone steps about 3 feet high cut out of the wall. At intervals we found little square rooms, very possibly where the men-at-arms slept. What a view at the top! The towers and roofs and courtyards of the castle lay before us. All around us the lovely English country, and as far as the eye could see, hills, woodland, and the winding river. It was glorious. Maud and I danced a 2-step in the ballroom. If stones could only talk! Well, if they could, I should want a long confab with each one in the old courtyard of Haddon Hall. Who can tell? William the Conqueror himself may have stepped on some of them. We drove from Haddon Hall to the Peacock Inn for luncheon, going over to Chatsworth for the afternoon. Again I turn a few leaves of the diary. Chatsworth is one of the homes of the Duke of Devonshire. The park is 14 miles across, and I don't know how big it is, but Dr. Wrench told me the number of acres, and I think it was 3,000 or 4,000. We drove 5 miles through the park before reaching the gates of Chatsworth. Shall I call it house or castle? I have pictures of it, and it is a good thing, for I could not describe it. Dr. Wrench, being the Duke's physician, was able to take us through the private rooms. On entering the hall, a broad marble staircase leads to the corridors above them, from which others branch out through different parts of the house. We walked miles, it seems, until we got to the Duke's private library. When you are once in the room, the doors are shut. You cannot tell how you got in or how you will get out. On every wall the bookcases are built in, and there is not an opening of any kind, not a break in the rows and rows of books. The explanation is simply this: the doors themselves are made to look like bookshelves painted on. Chatsworth is so large that were I living there I should want a cook's guide every time I moved. One picture gallery is full of sketches by Hogarth, and pictures of almost every old master you ever heard of, and some you never heard of. Opening out of this gallery are great glass doors leading into halls into which the different bedrooms open. In one bedroom the walls and ceiling were covered with oil paintings, not hanging but literally painted on them. The bed was a huge four-poster. The curtains were of heavy brocade satin. The windows looked out on terraces, garden and fountains. I like this room best of all. We were taken through the state apartments, where I saw on a throne a huge chair of state on a platform, with canopy over it, with the Duke's crest in gold woven upon it. In one of the drawing rooms we saw a life-size portrait of Henry VIII, a real true one, painted from life, and one of Philip II of Spain, and of Charles V, and of Anne of Austria. The Duke had sent special word from London to have the fountains in the park play for us, and we watched them from the window. They are beautiful, such nice shower baths for the marble statues on the terrace. The Prince of Wales has often visited Chatsworth, and a funny story was told about one of his visits. It was after dinner, and the drawing room was full of people. Whenever royalty is present, it is expected that the men will wear all their decorations. Well, the Earl of something or other had forgotten one of his, and someone reported this fact to the Prince, who sent for the culprit to be brought before him. At the time, the Prince was seated on one of the huge lounges, on which only a giant could sit and keep his feet on the floor. The Prince was sitting far back, and his feet stuck straight out in the air. When the guilty man was brought up to be reprimanded, the attitude of the Prince was far from dignified. His Royal Highness was not really angry, but he told the poor Earl of something or other that he must write out the oath of the order that he had forgotten to wear. It was a long oath, and the Earl's memory was not so long. End of section 31.